For nearly a week, nobody knew Linda Collins Smith was dead. And then her son and her father went to her home in Pocahontas, Arkansas, and found her body hidden in her own driveway, wrapped in a blanket and covered by a tarp. Linda was a former state senator. She had recently gone through a bitter divorce involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her political career had ended. Her finances were being fought over in court. But the person who killed her wasn't her ex-husband. It wasn't a political enemy. And it wasn't a stranger. It was one of her closest friends. A woman who had worked on Linda's political campaigns, helped her with business affairs, had access to her finances, and would eventually admit that she went to Linda's house, killed her, and hid her body. And somehow, that wasn't the end of it. Because while she was sitting in jail awaiting trial for Linda's murder, prosecutors say Rebecca O'Donnell began trying to arrange more killings from behind bars. I'm Aaron, and this is the murder of Linda Collins Smith, a case involving friendship, money, political connections, sealed court records, and an alleged murder-for-hire plot that began after the original murder had already been solved. Before we begin, this case involves murder and allegations of additional planned killings. We'll discuss the evidence and the allegations factually and distinguish between what was proven, what was admitted, and what remains unsolved. Let's go back to Pocahontas, Arkansas, and the life Linda Collins Smith had built before it began to come apart. Linda F. Collins was born in Pocahontas, Arkansas on April 17, 1962. By the time she died, she'd spent decades building a life there both as a businesswoman and a politician. And neither side of that life came easy to her. She married Philip Smith in 1995. Starting in 2001, the two of them owned and operated a Days Inn hotel in Pocahontas, a business they ran together for 15 years. In 2010, she was elected to the Arkansas House of Representatives, representing District 80, as a Democrat. About 8 months into that term, she switched her party registration to Republican. 2 years later, in 2012, she tried to move up to the state Senate, challenging incumbent David Wyatt. She lost that general election narrowly, 51.2% to 48.8%. That same year, she and her husband bought and began renovating an independent motel property. It opened the following year as the Rock and Roll Motel. In 2014, she ran for the Senate again, this time for District 19. She won, defeating her Democratic opponent James McLean by more than 16 points and took her seat in January 2015. Over the next several years, she introduced legislation like a bathroom access bill, the Arkansas Physical Privacy and Safety Act, which didn't pass, and back the True Campus Carry Act, which did. But her time in the Senate ended the way a lot of political careers end, at the ballot box, not by choice. In May 2018, she lost the Republican Senate primary to a challenger named James Sturch, 5,299 votes to 4,726, a race in which Sturch had the backing of Governor Asa Hutchinson. Her Senate term ran out the following January. By the time Linda Collins Smith was killed a little over a year later, she had already lost her seat, sold the hotel that had defined her business career, and separated from her husband of more than 20 years. Whatever else was happening in her life in the spring of 2019, it wasn't happening at the height of her public career. It was happening after most of that career and that marriage had already come apart. That marriage's unraveling ran on a second track entirely, a financial one, and it would end up tangled directly in the events leading to her death. She and Phil Smith separated in June of 2016. That same year, they sold the Days Inn for close to $1.2 million. Court records cited in reporting on the case show that Colin Smith withdrew roughly $850,000 of those proceeds into an account in her name alone. Among the specific items later disputed was a jointly issued federal treasury check for close to $428,000. In testimony on September 12, 2018, Colin Smith addressed the Days Inn sale proceeds directly, and when the divorce went to trial, the court found that about $550,000 of that money had gone unaccounted for over a 19-month period. On October 12, 2018, a Randolph County judge finalized their divorce, ruling that Smith could keep certain funds and that Colin Smith owed him $380,000. She didn't accept that outcome quietly. A month later, on November 13, 2018, she filed a notice of appeal, challenging the property division, the finding that she'd dissipated marital assets and the attorney fees she'd been ordered to pay. Appellate briefing began in February 2019, and she filed her own opening brief that April, about 7 weeks before she died. That appeal was still active when she was killed. The case would still have been in the middle of being litigated in the weeks after her body was found. A fight over money with her ex-husband that, remarkably, wasn't the one that got her killed. It would not be resolved by the courtroom fight that had consumed nearly 3 years of her life. It would be resolved after she was already gone. Now, there's a separate detail worth noting here, because it says something about who Phil Smith was during this period. He had been a sitting circuit judge, but he retired at the end of 2017 amid a complaint over his personal use of a judicial office equipment. In February 2019, just months before Colin Smith's death, the Arkansas Judicial Discipline and Disability Commission formally reprimanded him and secured his agreement never to serve in any judicial capacity again. So the man on the other side of this bitter financial fight had also recently left the bench, following a disciplinary matter of his own. While that legal battle with her ex-husband was playing out, the person closest to Linda Colin Smith day to day was a woman named Rebecca Lynn O'Donnell. Now, O'Donnell wasn't a stranger or a passing acquaintance. She was described as a longtime friend, a former campaign aide, and a business associate who worked alongside Colin Smith for years. She was 48 years old at the time of her arrest. O'Donnell's fiancé, a man named Tim Logains, reportedly held power of attorney over aspects of Colin Smith's financial affairs at various points. That's the kind of access that matters here. This wasn't someone on the outside of Linda Colin Smith's life. She was on the inside of it, close enough to her finances and close enough to her home. May 28, 2019 is the last day Linda Colin Smith is confirmed to have been alive. It's her last recorded social media activity, and it's the date investigators would later place as the day of the fatal stabbing. What we know about that specific day comes almost entirely through O'Donnell and her fiancé's later accounts. According to Tim Logains, O'Donnell told him she had brought Colin Smith's lunch that day. Separately, home security camera footage, recovered later and described through affidavit-based reporting, not confirmed firsthand by this video sourcing, reportedly shows O'Donnell inside the home that day. And by the time investigators searched the property, the cameras that would have recorded that day were gone. Whoever removed them and why is something the record doesn't fully answer. But their absence would become one of the case's most important threads. For nearly a week after May 28th, Nothing about her absence became part of the public record. Then, on June 4th, 2019, around 5:30 in the afternoon, her son, Butch Smith, and her father, Benny Collins, went to her home on Highway 90 west in Pocahontas. They found her body in the driveway, wrapped in a blanket, covered by a tarp, in an advanced state of decomposition, consistent with someone who had been dead for about a week. It was Colin Smith's own son and her own father who made that discovery. The Arkansas State Police responded to the scene, along with Randolph County Sheriff deputies. The Arkansas State Crime Lab dispatched forensic examiners, and the body's condition meant investigators couldn't visually identify her there. The state medical examiner took the remains to Little Rock. Some of the earliest news coverage, citing unnamed officials, described the death as resulting from a gunshot wound. That detail spread through initial reporting, but no official source ever confirmed it, and it did not hold up. On June 5th, the Arkansas State Police confirmed the remains were Linda Collins Smith's, using dental records and fingerprints. And when the medical examiner's findings became part of the official record, they told a different story than that first gunshot report. Linda Collins Smith had been stabbed. The medical examiner determined she'd suffered multiple stab wounds, at least 6. That is the confirmed cause of death. The gunshot description was an early, unconfirmed detail that didn't survive contact with the actual forensic finding. In the 10 days between the discovery of her body and an arrest, the public record goes fairly quiet. Officials said little, citing what they called the critical juncture of this investigation. The judge overseeing the case at that point, Harold Irwin, sealed the early investigative records. In the middle of that gap, on June 12, 2019, a regional outlet published a piece on the still pending divorce appeal, noting that Phil Smith's own response was due in a couple of days. A reminder that the financial fight between Colin Smith and her ex-husband was still actively moving through the courts, even as the murder investigation was just getting underway. Exactly what evidence, tip, or investigative step first pointed detectives towards Rebecca O'Donnell in those 10 days isn't really spelled out in the documents or reporting available in this case. What is clear, though, is what happened next. On June 14, 2019, at around 4 in the afternoon, Rebecca Lynn O'Donnell was pulled over during a traffic stop on Highway 62 West, near Burgess Road. She was taken into custody and charged with capital murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. She was held without bond. One account of that arrest describes O'Donnell as having been stopped on her way to a visitation, but the contemporaneous named source report from that day of the arrest describes only a traffic stop on Highway 62 West, with no mention of a funeral or visitation. That detail remains unresolved. This video follows a contemporaneous account. Sheriff Kevin Bell, speaking publicly around that time, said he couldn't explain exactly why O'Donnell had become a suspect, because doing so would interfere with the investigation. In the sheriff's own words, he described her as someone he considered homicidal from the very beginning. 3 days later, on June 17th, a judge found probable cause for the charges against her, a court appearance that some later summaries would mistakenly describe as the arrest date itself, when the actual arrest had already happened 3 days earlier on the highway. To place those dates side by side, Linda Collins Smith was last confirmed alive on May 28th. Her body was found 7 days later on June 4th. Rebecca O'Donnell was arrested 10 days later after that, and on June 14th, and formally faced a probable cause finding 3 days after that. In under 3 weeks, the case had moved from her disappearance to a capital murder charge against someone who had been one of her closest friends. It was also around the time of her arrest that investigators obtained the home security video connected to May 28th. According to affidavit-based reporting on the case, not a document independently reviewed for this video. That footage reportedly shows O'Donnell with blood on her hands, holding a large kitchen knife, and carrying a white purse described as blood smeared. Other portions reportedly show her moving or removing or tampering with the security cameras inside the home. Investigators believe the missing cameras had been taken to O'Donnell's own residence, though the sources reviewed for this case do not confirm they were actually recovered there or anywhere else. Here's what the footage does and doesn't establish. It places O'Donnell inside the residence on May 28th, the day investigators later identified as the day of the killing. It does not, according to the source being reviewed, show the stabbing itself. And whatever happened to the actual cameras, the knife or the purse after that, whether any of them were ever recovered, tested, or confirmed as the murder weapon, isn't documented in the available record. The security footage wasn't the only category of material investigators pursued. Records later released in the case described a broader effort that also included computer data, cloud storage records, and phone records, alongside the search warrant work on Colin Smith's bank account that would eventually surface the forged check evidence. What any of the additional material specifically showed isn't detailed in the reporting available here. Only that these were among the categories of evidence the investigation drew on before the case reached its resolution. Sometime in the weeks after the probable cause finding and before the case reached arraignment, the sealing of the early investigative records was already being tested. On June 12, 2019, the Arkansas Times reported that it had obtained and published details from the sealed probable cause affidavit before the document was officially released. The prosecutor's office denied leaking it. No source reviewed for this case identifies who, if anyone, was responsible for that early disclosure, and the matter was never resolved on the public record. It also notably is the closest thing to a documented irregularity anywhere in this investigation. No source reviewed identifies any confirmed investigative error beyond that one unresolved question of an early disclosure. On July 30th, 2019, O'Donnell appeared for arraignment. The hearing lasted about 25 minutes. She pleaded not guilty to all counts. Prosecutors, under then District Attorney Henry Boyce, announced they intended to seek the death penalty. The judge issued a gag order, and by most accounts, an unusually strict one. Legal observers would later describe it as one of the strictest gag orders in Arkansas history. That order stayed in effect until the records were partially unsealed in June 2020, the better part of a year in which almost nothing about the case's evidence became public. Then, while O'Donnell sat in pre-trial detention, the case took a sharp turn. On October 24, 2019, an inmate named Shanna Hembry reportedly told authorities that O'Donnell had approached her about arranging murders. 2 weeks later, on November 5th, jail surveillance reportedly captured O'Donnell passing papers, described as forged suicide notes, to another inmate, Cassandra Geoffrin. A follow-up interview on November 7th reportedly confirmed there was an additional alleged target beyond the first one identified. Now, these are serious allegations, and it's worth being clear that they come from jailhouse informants and surveillance footage as described in reporting on the case, not from the trial record, since this case never went to trial. O'Donnell's own defense attorney, Lee Short, would later push back publicly on the reliability of that kind of testimony. His characterization, as reported, was blunt. Inmates, he said, do it all the time, meaning they offer information like this to try to improve their own situations. That's a defense argument, not a judicial finding, and it was never tested by cross-examination in open court either. In the same window of time, the final weeks of 2019, something else was happening around this case. A judge was replaced. O'Donnell was placed under strict jail segregation for reasons that were never explained on the record, though that segregation was later lifted. And on December 4th or 5th, prosecutor Henry Boyce withdrew from the case entirely. No reason for this withdrawal was ever disclosed publicly. Boyce would soon be named as one of the alleged targets in the solicitation charges that followed. Nothing in the available reporting ties his withdrawal to that fact. These events simply happened close together in time. On December 20th, 2019, Judge Fogelman appointed a special prosecutor to take over, Robert Dittrich, a retired 38-year veteran prosecutor from Stuttgart, Arkansas, then 70 years old. 3 weeks after that, on January 14th, 2020, Rebecca O'Donnell was charged in Jackson County with 2 felony counts of solicitation to commit capital murder and 2 misdemeanor counts of solicitation to commit tampering with physical evidence. What prosecutors alleged, based on the jailhouse informant claims, was a plot with 4 alleged targets: Phil Smith, the ex-husband; Mary Smith, Phil Smith's subsequent wife; Judge Harold Erdwin, who had originally sealed the case records; and Henry Boyce, the prosecutor who had just withdrawn. The alleged plan reportedly involved payment in gold and silver, valued between $20,000 and $30,000, with instructions that Phil Smith's death be staged to look like a suicide. These Jackson County charges were separate from the Randolph County murder case. O'Donnell was already being held without bond on the original charges when the second case was filed, meaning she now faced 2 prosecutions in 2 different counties within Arkansas's 3rd Judicial District at the same time. O'Donnell would not be tried on these counts. She eventually entered a no-contest plea to 2 of them. And it's worth being precise about what that plea does and doesn't mean. A no-contest plea isn't a guilty plea. Legally, it resolves the charge the same way a conviction would for sentencing purposes. It produces a judgment against the defendant, but it isn't a factual admission that the specific allegations behind the charge are true. The plot, as prosecutors described it, the 4 targets, the staged suicide, the payment in gold and silver, was built entirely from jailhouse informants and their accounts and surveillance footage, and none of those specific claims were ever tested in open court. For most of 2019 and the first half of 2020, the public knew almost nothing beyond what had already leaked out. 3 different judges withdrew from the case before Fogelman took over, each citing potential conflicts of interest, on top of the prosecutor who had already withdrawn and the strictest gag order legal observers said they'd seen in the state. ABC News and the Arkansas Press Association eventually sued for access to the sealed records. On June 12, 2020, Judge Fogelman ruled in their favor, at least in part, ordering the unsealing of more than 50 case documents, opening them to the public and press for the first time since the case began. That ruling didn't end the secrecy around the case. Much of the file, which would eventually exceed 20,000 pages, remained restricted, but it opened the door to the details that had been building behind the gag order for a year. 2 months later, the case ended. On August 6, 2020, Rebecca O'Donnell appeared in court and pleaded guilty, not no contest, guilty, to first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse in Randolph County. In the same proceedings, she pleaded no contest to the 2 solicitation counts out of Jackson County. In her own words entered into the court record that day, she said, "I went to Linda's house and I intentionally killed her and then hid the body." That plea carries specific legal weight. She had originally been charged with capital murder, and prosecutors had said they'd seek the death penalty. The case instead resolved with a guilty plea to first-degree murder. There was no trial. No jury ever heard the evidence. The case ended by agreement between O'Donnell and the prosecution. Some later coverage of this case, including the same 2022 ABC News special referenced earlier, has described O'Donnell as convicted of capital murder. But that's not accurate. Every source from the time of the plea itself is consistent. She pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, not capital murder. The capital murder description that shows up in some later secondary coverage appears to be an imprecise characterization, not a different account of what actually happened in court that day. Judge Fogelman handed down that sentence in that same proceeding. On the Randolph County counts, O'Donnell received 40 degrees for first-degree murder and 3 years for abuse of a corpse, 43 years in total. On the Jackson County solicitation counts, she received 7 years, with the 2 counts running concurrently with each other. That 7-year sentence was ordered to run consecutively after the Randolph County time, meaning it's added on top rather than served alongside. So 43 plus 7, a combined sentence of 50 years in the Arkansas Departments of Correction. One report had suggested O'Donnell could eventually become eligible for parole, though no specific eligibility date has been independently confirmed in the sources reviewed for this case. 2 weeks after the plea deal on August 21st, 2020, additional court documents became public, laying out more of the evidence behind the case, the forged checks, the alleged financial motive, and further detail on the security camera footage. According to that material, O'Donnell had admitted in a search warrant affidavit, not a trial, to forging Linda Collins Smith's signature on checks from Collins Smith's bank accounts numerous times. No total dollar figure for that forged check activity is available in any of the record reviewed, and there's no indication that there was a formal handwriting analysis that was ever made public. What the checks are described as supporting is the financial motive theory that prosecutors built the case around, that O'Donnell had been taking money from Collins Smith, that a confrontation over the missing funds followed, and that the killing grew out of that confrontation. Butch Smith, in his own public statements, has described that same financial confrontation explanation. Because the case ended in a plea rather than a trial, that motive theory was never tested by cross-examination or weighing by a jury. It's the operative explanation offered by investigators, prosecutors, and the victim's son, not an established fact through adversarial proceedings. That prosecution theory wasn't the only account of the money in circulation. According to reporting on O'Donnell's own statements, she offered a different framing of her financial dealings with Collins Smith, that she had been using hotel funds to help cover Collins Smith's bills, because Collins Smith has no income since January. Now that's O'Donnell's own account as reported, not an independently verified explanation. And it competes directly with the theory that the checks represented theft. It is not treated here as an established fact. Beyond the legal record, this case left a very human trail. Butch Smith and his sister, Heather Tate Williams, discovered and then had to process the loss of their mother in the most public way possible, through a year of sealed court filings, a gag order, and national news coverage. In later interviews, Butch Smith described something striking, that in the aftermath of the discovery, before the children knew of any connection between O'Donnell and their mother's death, O'Donnell had hugged him at the police station and apologized. He has also said in interviews that he believes others may have been involved in what happened to his mother. That's his personal view. No one else was ever charged in this case, and the record doesn't support it as an established fact. It's included here because it's part of how the family has processed this loss, not because the investigation confirms it. The children also inherited unfinished business from their mother's life. Butch Smith later became administrator of her estate, and Heather Tate Williams stood to inherit as her heir. The divorce appeal, the one still being litigated when Collins Smith died, over hundreds of thousands of dollars in disputed proceeds from the days in sale, did not simply end with her death either. A settlement was later reported in September 2019, 3 months after she was killed. In that same property division appeal reported through the sources reviewed for this case, do not independently confirm it beyond that reporting. Her opening brief in that appeal had been filed roughly 7 weeks before she was killed. The specific terms of the reported settlement aren't detailed in the sources reviewed for this case. Some secondary accounts of this case list the divorce's finalization a year later than it actually happened. The October 2018 date is the one corroborated by multiple independent sources, including the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. The later date appears to be either a mix-up with this separately reported September 2019 settlement of the appeal, or simply a summarization error in the source material itself. What the record does show is that the financial fight that had defined the last years of Linda Collins Smith's life did not remain an open question for long after she died. 2 weeks after the plea, on August 25, 2020, Butch Smith and Heather Tate Williams went back to court, this time in Pulaski County, before Judge Kathy Compton, seeking a protective order over sensitive personal material contained in the more than 20,000-page investigative file. 7 different media outlets had filed public record requests for that file. The family wanted certain material shielded, even as the broader push for transparency continued. Reporting from December 2021 indicates a judge later ordered the release of additional file material, though the full content of that ruling isn't confirmed in the sources available for this video. The case didn't disappear from the public attention after the plea. In October 2022, ABC News aired a 2020 segment on the murder, featuring interviews with 2 of O'Donnell's former cellmates, Melissa Duade and Cassandra Geoffrion, along with Sheriff Kevin Bell, Tim Loganes, and Heather Tate Williams. Those cellmate interviews focused on jailhouse conduct described earlier in this story, revisited years later on camera. Reporting also references a 2-hour NBC Dateline episode on the case, titled The Hands of the Killer, described in some sources as airing in July 2024, though the exact broadcast date isn't independently confirmed in the sources reviewed here either. Whatever else remains unresolved about this case, it's clearly one that continued to draw national attention years after the courtroom part of it ended. But none of that later media attention resolved the open questions the case left behind. There's a lot about this case that remains genuinely unknown, and those gaps are worth naming rather than smoothing over. What specifically identified O'Donnell as a suspect in the 10 days between the discovery of the body and her arrest has never been publicly documented. Whether the security cameras removed from Colin Smith's home were ever recovered isn't confirmed. The same is true for the knife and the purse described in the surveillance footage. Whether either was tested or tied conclusively to the killing doesn't appear anywhere in the available record. Henry Boyce's reason for withdrawing as prosecutor was never made public, and neither was the reason a judge was replaced or O'Donnell was placed under unexplained jail segregation in that same stretch of late in 2019. 3 overlapping events with no documented explanation, and no source establishing that any of them were connected to one another. The identity of whoever gave the Arkansas Times its early look at the sealed affidavit was never established either. And what's happened to Rebecca O'Donnell since 2022, her current custodial status, whether she's filed any post-conviction appeals, isn't documented in the sources reviewed for this case. The most recent substantive reporting located dates to that year, even after the confirmed June 2020 unsealing ruling and a reported, though not fully confirmed, further release of file material in December 2021. Most of that 20,000-page investigative file has never been made fully public. Only summaries and excerpts filtered through news reporting are available to review, which means there's very likely more in that file than any single account of this case, including this one, actually reflect, is documented. And what the record does establish clearly is this: a former state senator whose political career had ended the year before, in the middle of an unresolved fight over hundreds of thousands of dollars with her ex-husband, was killed by stabbing sometime around May 28, 2019. And her body lay hidden in her own driveway for a week before her son and father found it. The woman who pleaded guilty to killing her was a longtime friend and former campaign aide, someone close enough to her finances to allegedly forge her signature, and close enough to her home to be captured on its own security cameras. While that case moved through a court system defined by an unusually strict gag order, sealed records, and multiple judicial withdrawals, O'Donnell was separately accused of trying to arrange more killings from behind bars, including a plot against the ex-husband Linda Collins Smith had spent her final months fighting in a bitter divorce appeal. That appeal outlived her by only months. A settlement was reported that September. It's a case that ran on two clocks at once, a private financial war measured in months and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a criminal case measured in years, sealed records, and shifting prosecutors. In the end, none of the criminal allegations went to trial either. On August 6, 2020, in a courtroom in Arkansas, Rebecca O'Donnell said the words that closed the case: that she had gone to Linda's house, killed her, and hidden the body. 50 years followed. The rest, the missing cameras, the undisclosed reason a prosecutor walked away, the source of an early leak in a case built on secrecy, a son's belief that someone else might have been involved, stays exactly where the record leaves it: unresolved. It's the kind of case that shows how much sealed records can stay inside of a public court system, not through any single conspiracy, but through the ordinary mechanics of a gag order, plea deals, an investigative file that has still never been fully opened to the people who keep asking about it. And that's where we leave this case. We know who killed Linda Collins Smith. We know because Rebecca O'Donnell eventually stood in court and admitted that she went to Linda's home, intentionally killed her, and hid her body. But knowing who did it isn't the same thing as knowing everything that happened. There was no trial. Much of the investigative file remains outside public view, and some of the strangest details surrounding this case, the missing security cameras, the prosecutor who withdrew without publicly explaining why, and the allegations of additional killings being planned from inside jail, never received the kind of public examination the trial might have provided. The murder is solved. The entire story isn't. Some questions have answers, others may never get them. But here, we'll always try to separate what we know from what we think we know. I'm Aaron. Thanks for watching. If there's a case you think deserves this kind of examination, tell us about it below in the comments. And if you want more deep dives like this one, subscribe. I'll see you in the next case.